Welcome back to our second installment in the Intro to Marxism series. Today we're going to be talking about class struggle, which is a really fundamental part of Marxist philosophy and politics. So the recommended reading for today was section 1 of the Communist Manifesto, Bourgeois and Proletarians. So I'm going to refer to that quote quite a bit and attempt to stay true to the text as much as possible while providing my own commentary. Before we do that, however, let's start by asking the simple question, what actually is a class? Well, when most people think of class, they usually define this according to the amount of wealth a person has, or the amount of money that they earn. In this conception of class, poor or working class people earn a small amount of money, middle class people earn a bit more, and the upper classes, or the rich people, earn the most. So this is how we commonly talk about class and how we commonly think about class. However, the Marxist conception of class is really entirely different. To Marxists, your class position is instead defined by economic relations, usually your relation to the means of production and your relation to other classes in society. Now, the term means of production, just to clarify, refers to things used in society to produce goods. So examples of means of production would be factory equipment, machinery, large land holdings, technology, and so on. So some people might own means of production, while others do not. And these two groups of people would thus form two different classes. We'll get into this a bit more, but think of, as an example, a slave economy. The slave masters in this economy own the plantations that the slaves work on, and they own the slaves themselves, right? But the slaves own nothing. So, thus, they each have a relationship to the means of production. The slave owner owns the means of production, the slave owns nothing, and they have a relationship with each other. So, they're two different economic classes, and that's the basic idea. Okay, so let's get into the manifesto now. Immediately after the preamble to the manifesto, so right at the start of section 1, Marx and Engels immediately open with this sort of grand statement that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. So what they're doing is they're really placing this idea of class struggle at the front and center of their theory of society and history. And they give several examples of class structures in previous societies. So, for example, under feudalism, we had the class of the lords and the nobility versus the class of serfs who worked on the lord's land. And there are some other classes as well in feudal society, like skilled workers who worked in guilds and so on, merchants, etc. And as I mentioned, in a slave society, like if you think about ancient Greece, then you have slave masters and slaves, right? So according to Marx and Engels, you can basically see, and this is quite profound, you can basically see all previously existing societies, with the exception of hunter-gatherer communities, as having these various classes contending for power. So it's really a grand historical narrative, and we'll see that more when you talk about historical materialism a bit more in the next session. Okay, but we're talking about history now. What about present-day capitalist society? What classes exist today? Well, Marx and Engels write that our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinctive feature. It has simplified the class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. Now again, as I mentioned, if you look into it, you'll see that the feudal class structure is actually quite complicated. There aren't only lords and serfs, there are also merchants, guildsmen. The church has its own role in society, its political role, its economic role. So they could, church members, clergymen could form their own economic class in a sense. There are knights, etc. But in contrast, Marx and Engels say that capitalism, or the epoch of the bourgeoisie, as they put it, has a much simpler class binary, essentially. You're either bourgeois or proletariat. So what makes someone belong to either class? What makes you bourgeois or proletarian? Well, let's start with the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie are essentially the group of people who own the means of production. In a word, they own capital, so they are the capitalists. They're also the dominant class in society in the sense that they have the majority of economic and political power. Now, the proletariat or the working class, they essentially own no means of production. In other words, they don't have capital, they don't have their own businesses or their own means of generating wealth. So instead, they have to work for a capitalist, a member of the bourgeoisie, and they sell their labor power for a wage to the capitalist who owns the factory or the business that they work at. So again, the proletariat sell their labor power to the capitalist pays them a wage, the proletarians work for the capitalist. Very simple sort of idea. Now, it is a bit more complicated than this, and we'll talk about a few of the other classes, but essentially, the narrative that Marx and Engels are pushing is that basically you're going to be the majority of society will fall into these two groups, especially as capitalism progresses, as we'll see. Okay, so how did this come about? Well, Marx and Engels actually describe at length how the bourgeoisie came to power, and I'm not going to go into all of the detail right now. I mean, you can read the section in the Communist Manifesto yourself. You could also read Part 8 of Capital Volume 1. I think it's Part 8. It's the last part of Capital Volume 1. Is all about primitive accumulation, which is basically the way that the means of production became concentrated in a small number of hands among the bourgeoisie, basically. But I do love this one quote, which I think kind of sums it up really well. So I do apologize, it's quite a wall of text, but let's just get through it. So they say, quote, "The bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless, indefeasible, chartered freedoms, has set up that single, unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation veiled by religious and political institutions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation." So what they're saying here is that when the bourgeoisie came to power, it overthrew all the old feudal hierarchies, the feudal class structure, and developed its own society, bourgeois society or capitalism, which served its own purposes, and it created a new world in its image, so to speak. And this is why Marxists view the bourgeoisie as the ruling class. It rose to power during feudalism, overthrew the feudal nobility and monarchy, and made its own society, which naturally functions to maintain its own interests. So an example of this kind of bourgeois revolution, the sort of prototypical example, is the French Revolution of 1789, which is, again, a common example of a bourgeois revolution. Okay, so as I mentioned before, despite the fact that, Marx and Engels say society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, there are a few other classes in capitalist society which we need to consider. And as we'll see, these classes are sort of all becoming less and less significant as capitalism advances because they're sort of dying off, or they're a small part of capitalist society in any case. Okay, so let's talk about the petty bourgeoisie to start off with. This refers to what we might call small business owners. So like people who own their own shops, but they don't, employ a lot of people, or maybe you like own a car wash where you wash the cars yourself, or it's a family-run business, a mom and pop shop type thing. So they generally don't own large amounts of capital. They don't employ a bunch of people, but they do have their own businesses, or they have an independent source of income outside of working for a wage. So in other words, they aren't the captains of industry who are employing the labor of hundreds or thousands of people. Now, the problem that the petty bourgeois have with capitalism is that they're eventually crushed by the system. Their small amount of capital isn't really sufficient to compete with larger businesses And many small businesses end up failing and going bankrupt as industries and capital become more centralized and monopolized. So a good example would be to think about what's happened with supermarkets in the last few decades. And this dynamic isn't as obvious in South Africa, but it is in other capitalist countries. But even in South Africa, you can think about the fact that just a few decades ago, people used to go to independent, small greengrocers, independent butchers, bakers, fishmongers, milkmen, and so on. But now there are a small number of companies who essentially control the majority or almost the entirety of the food market. It's like Spar, Checkers, uh, Pick and Pay, Woolworths, and ShopRite, maybe. These four or five companies that almost all people in South Africa would probably buy their food from. Or if you want to think about Britain, you can think of Asda, Waitrose, Sainsbury's, Morrison's, Aldi, Lidl, and that would basically cover Tesco. Again, a handful of companies that control the majority of the food market. So the petty bourgeoisie, because of this, is kind of a dying class. They either will, their business will succeed, which is very rare, and they'll become big capitalists, or they'll be proletarianized as their small businesses fail, or they can't compete. And sure, there might always be a petty bourgeoisie, but they're never a big part of capitalist society as a general rule. Okay, so then the second bullet we have here is the peasantry, people who own small plots of land which they essentially use for their own production. And again, they're also kind of a dying class because as capitalism advances, large landholders will buy up or seize smaller farms, and the peasantry is gradually destroyed. And in the advanced capitalist nations, like in the United States, Canada, Western Europe, and so on, you'll see that there's almost no peasantry at this point. If you look into the history of something like the Enclosure Act in England, for instance, this was a set of acts that were meant to essentially upset the old feudal land relations in rural England and basically dispossess the peasantry or the old feudal serfs of their land and send them to cities where they would then become the industrial proletariat for the Industrial Revolution. Okay, and then lastly we have the lumpen proletariat, or the underclass, as I put them. Here's how Marx and Engels describe them. Let's just read this because I think it is quite a good summary or a good explanation. They call them the dangerous class, the lumpen proletariat, the social scum, that passively rotting mass, thrown off by the lowest layers of the old society, may here and there be swept into the movement by a proletarian revolution. Its conditions of life, however, prepare it far more for the part of a bribed tool of reactionary intrigue. Now, the lumpen proletariat is usually a small section of capitalist society, which consists of unemployed people, the homeless, beggars, petty criminals, maybe small-scale drug dealers, and so on. And Marx is usually quite mean to them, and he thinks that they don't really have much revolutionary potential. I'll get to talking about the revolutionary potential of the proletariat in just a second. But as a quick aside, an interesting thing to consider here to contextualize this to South Africa is that because of our high amounts of unemployment, we actually have a very large lumpen proletariat in South Africa compared to, again, like the imperialist nations, the advanced capitalist nations. We have super high unemployment. We have lots of homeless people or people who live in informal settlements, right? We have beggars. You can barely stop at a street corner without seeing a bunch of people sitting on the side of the road asking for money, right? So that's something interesting when we think about South Africa's situation specifically. But okay, let's move on. We've talked a lot about what class is and what the various classes are, but let's now get to how they come into conflict with each other. And we've seen now that all societies have classes within them, and the conflict essentially occurs because these classes have fundamentally different interests. And what we need to understand here is that under capitalism, the bourgeoisie hold a tremendous amount of political and economic power, despite the fact that they are, of course, a tiny minority of society, while the proletariat hold relatively little. And this means that the existing political structures and economic relations act almost entirely in the interest of the bourgeois at the expense of the workers, the proletariat. So the entirety of capitalist or bourgeois society is based on and organized around the bourgeoisie exploiting the labor of the proletariat in order to enrich themselves. And when we talk a bit more about Marxian economics, we'll get more into how Marx and Engels, or how Marx views this exploitation and how it occurs exactly. But the most important thing to realize for now is that those with private property use and exploit the labors of others to create private wealth at the expense of their workers. And again, it's important to keep in mind that this is astoundingly undemocratic, of course, because the proletariats are the vast majority of society, the bourgeoisie are the tiny minority. In fact, a lot is often made in Marxist discourse. A lot is often discussed about this idea of social production, right? Hundreds of people, thousands of people work together to produce products, but the majority of the wealth and those products are accumulated in the hands of a small number of people, the people who control the means of production, the bourgeoisie. So that's another interesting thing to think about. But that thing that I just mentioned, which is that the proletariat is a majority of society, Marx and Engels take this to be very serious, and they think it actually makes the proletariat a particularly special class in history. And so they write, and again, sorry, it's a wall of text, but let's get through it. They write that all previous historical movements were movements of minorities, or in the interest of minorities. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority, in the interest of the immense majority. The proletariat, the lowest stratum of our present society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up, without the whole superincumbent strata of official society being sprung into the air. So what they're saying is that if you think about something like the rise of the bourgeoisie were not the majority under feudalism, even though they arose during feudalism. They were a minority. The majority of people were peasants or serfs. Um, and the interesting thing that Marx pointing out about the proletariat is that, well, they're actually, like I said, the majority of society. And so when they rise up, the whole society is upset. The super incumbent strata is being sprung into the air, if you want to put it in that sort of fancy language. Um, but it upsets the entirety of society because, of course, bourgeois society can really not function without the labor of the proletariat. So that's why the proletariat have the revolutionary ability as well, because they can bring the entire system of production, the entire society down, because it depends on them in the way that they don't necessarily depend on the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie needs the proletariat, but does the proletariat need the bourgeoisie? Perhaps not as much. Now, another thing that Marx and Engels talk about is how the conditions of capitalist production actually cause the proletariat to become more revolutionary. So not just that they have their own interests, but they become conscious of themselves as a class and have a class interest. So they write, again, the last wall of text, I promise. The essential conditions for the existence and for the sway of the bourgeois class is the formation and augmentation of capital. The condition for capital is wage labor. Wage labor rests exclusively on competition between the laborers. The advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the laborers, due to competition, by the revolutionary combination, due to association. The development of modern industry, therefore, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. So, Marx and Engels don't just view the proletariat as special because they have some moral objection to capitalism, whatever. What they're saying is they're the only revolutionary class, and what makes them more revolutionary is actually the conditions that bourgeois society promotes, because what bourgeois society does is it concentrates workers in population centers, so cities, but also within workplaces. So previously, in feudalism, you had people working on their own plots of land, the serfs, or you had small cottage industries. But now you have, in the time of Marx and Engels, it was the Industrial Revolution, right? So you have giant factories where thousands of people are working together, or hundreds of people are working together. And so they're in close connection with each other. They have a common experience, and thus they can see their commonalities and they can build solidarity between each other. They can organize as workers and form unions or things like that, worker organizations. So that's what he's saying. The bourgeoisie are producing their own gravediggers by bringing the proletariat together and helping them to actually become more conscious of their collective experience. Um, that last little sentence is something that Marx and Marxists are often criticized a lot for. And this idea of the victory of the proletariat is inevitable. And given the history of what we know in the 20th century, unfortunately, the actually existing socialism of the 20th century, uh, regardless of what you think of the realities of the Soviet Union, ultimately it didn't work out. We didn't reach, the higher phase of full communism or whatever. And so, um, that victory of the proletariat, is it as inevitable as Marx thought? It certainly hasn't happened yet. Um, so maybe that's something we need to think about, and something that Marx and Marxists are very commonly criticized for. And even something that a lot of Marxists would disagree with. But okay, I'd like to just leave you with a few closing remarks about how to apply this to South Africa and how we need to think about class struggle in South Africa. Because ultimately, we want to contextualize this theory to our current political situation. That's the point of learning it, right? And when we think about property relations in South Africa, we also have to consider the racial inequalities in our country that were caused by centuries of colonialism and apartheid. And I'm sure we're all familiar with, for example, the land reform question, right? 72% of private farmland is owned by, 8 or 9% of the population, the white population. So, and white people also generally have much lower unemployment and earn better salaries than, basically anyone who isn't white. So what that means is that colonized people in South Africa, black people, colored people, just people who aren't white in general, will probably have way more interest as a whole in a radical movement that's overturning the current society, the current system, because they're much poorer and much more exploited by the current system. Um, than white people who disproportionately benefit much more from the status quo. Again, as a general phenomenon. And obviously, there is still a white working class to some degree, but as a percentage of the white population, it's not nearly as big as the black working class. There are a lot more petty bourgeois white people, and it's more privileged than the black working class in general as well. White people have lower unemployment and so on. So that's an important thing to consider is also the racial elements of the class structure in South Africa. But okay, we could maybe talk about that a bit more in the discussion. I think that's all I'll leave you with for now. So thank you for listening, and now we'll move on to discussion and Q&A.